Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody to a new edition of Neocon Podcast. And I'm sitting here with Professor Eugene Kontorovics. Professor Kontorovich is well known worldwide as an expert on international law, expert on the history of the State of Israel. Professor Kontorovich, thank you very much for taking this, and welcome to Budapest.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk your forte first. International law. Could you explain what is international law? And I ask this because this word or this term, international law, is thrown around by basically everybody, and no one really knows what it means. Is there a book called International Law that everybody's referring to? Is there an agreed system of international law? How would you define international law? I know it's a course in university, and I know you could get a doctorate in international law, but could you explain shortly to our viewers what is international law?
So, briefly, international law is a system of rules designed to govern countries. And the question is, where would you get such a system of rules from? So, the rules that govern people in their daily lives are designed by the sovereign government of their country. Their legislatures, their prime ministers, their kings. But what is the government that is above countries? There is no government that is above countries. So in international law, the idea is that the rules of international law are rules that countries agree to govern their own dealings. So what does it mean that countries agree to rules? So let's say countries want to decide under what circumstances they'll conduct trade with each other, or what are going to be the understandings when they exchange diplomats. So they'll sign a treaty, and the main form of international law is treaties in which countries agree to certain rules that will govern their mutual relationships. Now, so the basic rule of international law is all countries have sovereignty, and they're equal in their sovereignty. And as a result, because there's nothing above a country's sovereignty, the only way a country can be told what to do is if it agrees. Now, what's it mean that it agrees? It doesn't agree necessarily about a specific outcome, but it agrees to specific rules. So international law mostly consists of treaties. Now, those treaties can bind countries, and it also means that countries can quit those treaties. Now, people often mistake international law as being synonymous with some kind of morality or justice. When you see that international law is just the rules that countries agree to, you'll see it may happen to include justice, it may happen to not include justice. For example, the notion of sovereignty of countries means that one country cannot invade another country to stop a domestic massacre in the first country because of sovereignty. That may not align with justice, but clearly is what international law says. Now, there are people who want to suggest that international law is A, the rules that countries agree to, and B, ideas about what rules countries should agree to that international law professors have. That is not a form of international law. But there is a second form of international law called custom. So custom has become less fundamental in international law.
Is custom the same as precedent?
No. Precedent is like the legal force of a judicial decision. But there are basically no judicial decisions in international law because there aren't so many international courts. Maybe we'll talk about the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, but they're not courts in the ordinary sense. That is to say, they decide very few cases. And they don't have general jurisdiction. They can't just, you can't just take a country to the ICJ unless it's Israel. Typically, you need their consent, and so these courts decide very limited number of cases about very limited number of issues. Custom is the idea that sometimes, making a treaty sometimes involves complex logistics. Not anymore, really. Today, it's pretty easy to make a treaty because you can fly around easily. But it used to be the case when it was hard for everybody to get together and have a big international conference in Vienna or Paris or wherever, that if countries repeatedly engage in a certain practice with a sense of legal obligation, that is to say, they do it in a sense like they're doing it because they're following the rule, rather than because it happens to be in their interest, that rule can become binding upon the countries themselves. But notice what's binding. It's the rules that are binding. Now, as to what a country should do in any particular circumstance, that requires interpreting the rule and applying it to particular circumstances. For example, Geneva Conventions. Pretty much every country is signatory of the Geneva Conventions. Those are rules about warfare. But at the same time, there could be disagreements about what those rules mean. That does not mean that any particular interpretation of the Geneva Convention is privileged. So some people might say, I'm Amnesty International. I call myself a human rights group. I'm going to interpret the Geneva Convention. Countries have a right to interpret the Geneva Convention itself, and often it leaves wide room for interpretation, which means there's not always going to be an international rule. And I think that's the most important thing to say. Because there's no international legislature, there's no international regulatory commission, administrative agency making rules and rules and rules. For most issues of international law, there often won't be a rule. And some people find that frustrating because they want everything to be governed by international law. So they'll try to maybe bootstrap or make up some rules of international law. But in fact, international law is relatively thin as a body of rules.
So when the state of Israel is being accused currently, as it is being accused currently of breaking international law, let's say in the way they conduct their military operations, the anti-terror operations in Gaza and elsewhere, what does that mean really? It's just that a fancy term so that makes everybody scared? Meaning, they hear the word international law and they already proclaim a villain? Or is that really based on anything? And when they go and investigate, which ICC did not, or ICJ did not, and perhaps will not, is there some sort of a binding document that they could,
There are binding documents. They don't necessarily provide answers, and I think that's why these terms are being used. So first of all, Israel is being accused of genocide. Israel is being accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity.
Right.
And I think part of the reason is because those things sound very heavy.
Very heavy.
And indeed, those things were created in part to punish the kind of crimes that Nazis committed against the Jews in Europe. And I think that's part of the reason Israel is being accused of these crimes.
So it's a mere PR stunt.
There's a kind of mirror, the use of the words is so heavy that it triggers like an automatic condemnation. But also, what's the Genocide Convention say? The Genocide Convention says the crime of genocide is when you destroy a group, like an ethnic or religious group, in whole or in part. So we know what it's about. It's about the Holocaust. It's about an attempt to purposefully destroy groups.
Well, the term was created after the Holocaust.
Exactly, and that's what the Genocide Convention was created after the Holocaust. And to do this by large-scale killing of the civilian population. So they say, but look, in fighting against Hamas, you are killing part of the Palestinian people. That's true. That's true. Part of the Palestinian, whoever the civilian casualties are being killed. So they say, that's genocide. Now, what does that mean? That means, but at the same time, Israel's fighting a defensive war. Defensive war is inherently legal. That is to say, the United Nations Charter says that self-defense is an inherent privilege of countries. So Israel's allowed to fight this war. It is impossible to fight any war without killing some civilians. It is not illegal for civilians to die in a war, so long as they're not directly targeted. So if Hamas hides behind human shields, and Israel targets Hamas, with the death of the human shields...
So long as you don't target the civilians themselves...
Yes, purposefully, yes.
Purposefully. Genocide is just...
Has there ever been a genocide committed without any civilians being deliberately targeted? It's not what we mean by genocide. But the point is, and indeed the ICJ has not said that Israel is committing genocide.
Yes, it did not.
But when you say, it's kind of like accusing Israel of becoming an apartheid state.
Let's talk about that too.
All of this is a kind of rhetorical inflation. The idea is there's no apartheid in Israel because there's no apart. What's apartheid mean? It means when you keep people separate. There's no separate facilities. Arabs, Jews, they go to the same movie theaters, cafes, There's no separate anything. But the point of using these terms is when you repeat it, it creates a association in people's minds. So take someone who doesn't know much about it, they think, okay, maybe it sounds like a bit of an exaggeration that Israel is guilty of genocide. So maybe it's like half genocide.
But it sounds bad enough for people to have a bad taste in their mouths.
And that is the idea. But whereas Israel is now currently fighting, I would say one of the most restrained and clean wars fought in modern times in an urban setting, and Israel is going to unprecedented lengths to spare Palestinian civilians. Hamas is, of course, obstructing that effort. But the label of genocide is designed to make it, to create a bad association around Israel, and to make a defensive war illegal. So ironically, the claim of genocide is being used to facilitate genocide, which is Hamas's goal.
Let's talk a little bit about the legitimacy of first the state of Israel and then the claim of a Palestinian state. Okay, because many people already question. Israel has celebrated its 76th anniversary of its proclamation, and many people question the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Many people also don't know that, based on from your lectures, what I understand is that the legitimacy of the state of Israel was not given in 47, or not necessarily were given in 1947 by the United Nations proposal, let's say, but some 20-some years before that, in the San Remo conference. Could you explore a little bit about this, which is a point that many people do not know? What was the San Remo conference? What mandates did it have, and what mandates does the United Nations have or don't have?
Okay. So first of all, I want to say the most important date for the legitimacy of Israel was 1948, when Israel declared independence. That is how Israel became a state. That is to say, Israel did not become a state because the international community gave it a state. Nobody gives anybody a state. Israel became a state by exercising independence and meeting...
Yeah, but hang on. Anybody could go and proclaim a state? Is that how it works?
So if they actually get control of the territory, that's required.
So what's required? You have to have control over a territory.
So a state has to actual control of a territory, an actual functioning government, and then international recognition additionally. To those are the criteria of
statehood.
But that is to say, when you say what is Israel's right to exist, I want to point out that's not a question that we ask about countries. What's the basis for Jordan's legitimacy?
Or the United States or Hungary.
Or Hungary or Canada or Syria or in a very strange situation. You have a country called the Saudi Arabia. It's a country named after a family. What's the legitimacy? Who gave them this? I mean, they have a story that it's from Allah. But in international law, we don't actually, when you have a country that is functioning, how it came to exist, you don't look under the hood. This is only done with respect to Israel. Because why does the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan have a right to exist? So this notion of looking to check whether a country should exist is not something that is done
on its face.
with existing countries. Frankly, it sounds, I would say, almost Putinesque. That is to say, that's what Vladimir says. Ukraine's not a real country. These people aren't. So if you have a country, it's real. It's hard to become a country. And Israel fought a war of independence that lost 1% of its population. But when I say that 1948 is the important date, and that Israel had very good international legal claims for independence in 1948. But had the Jews not won the war...
The War of Independence you're referring
the
to?
War of Independence.
Then
nobody would have come and helped. Nobody would have come and give us a state. They wouldn't have voted us a state of the United Nations.
Forced it to have a state.
Spain and Ireland would not have recognized a state. And for the Jews, it would just be tough luck. But we mentioned Jordan. And actually, Jordan and Israel come from the same body of international law. After the collapse of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires and the Turkish empires, the three empires collapsed, there was a question what to do. So Hungary is part of the solution in Austro-Hungary, but Austro-Hungary didn't have foreign colonies, overseas colonies. Germany and the Turks had a broad overseas empire. And so the question was what to do with those places. And so the idea in the early 20th century was to allow them to become independent nation states. Now, most of these places did not have democratic traditions. They didn't have pre-existing parliaments. So the idea they'd be put under the tutelage of
supervision, basically.
Supervision, very much like the United Nations in Bosnia, actually. Nation-building process to set up institutions to create new nations. And so these were called mandates, and dozens of them were issued around the world. For example, Lebanon, former League of Nations mandate. Syria, Jordan.
The Mesopotamian mandate
became
perhaps
Iraq.
the most famous of
Became Iraq, exactly. So the League of Nations, which was created after World War I by treaties, right? Where does the League of Nations get its power from? Again, it does not have any power just by calling itself. You can call yourself the League of Nations. You can call yourself the Justice League of America, like they do in the cartoons. Calling yourself, it's because they have a treaty. That's what gives them the power. The countries of the world said that we agree that they will determine the borders, and Turkey agreed they will determine these what the new states will be. And so the League of Nations issued several mandates. These mandates formed the borders of the Middle East. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, all owe their existence to these mandates. So one of the mandates was the mandate for Palestine. And the League of Nations said the Jewish people shall also have a national home in Palestine. Why in Palestine? Because the League of Nations said that's where the Jews are from. Because they're the indigenous people. Unindigenous people.
Which was already recognized by the Balfour Declarations a few years prior.
Right. The difference is the Balfour Declaration was a declaration just of British government policy, and this was adoption of that policy by a much
many
broader,
other countries.
By 50-some countries. So the League of Nations mandate was to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now, all of the mandates wind up becoming countries. Jordan. So the League of Nations mandate also had a provision in it that if the borders of the mandatory Palestine were unwieldy for the creation of a Jewish state within the whole thing, it could be split in the middle to create a two-state solution and to create an Arab state next to a Jewish state. And the British exercised that option, splitting it in the middle at the Jordan River, and thus creating...
Trans-Jordan became Jordan.
And they invited their Hashemite friends to run it, and it became the Hashemite. So if anyone ever asks, why does Jordan have a right to exist? People don't ask that, because that's not a question that's asked about countries other than Israel. There's one reason for the existence of Jordan, for its borders, and for its Hashemite monarchy, and that is the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. So if you don't believe in the
very same mandate
exactly.
that basically gave right for the Jewish state to exist, what were the borders of that Jewish state?
Everything west of the Jordan River,
including what's Judea Samaria, commonly known as there was West Bank, Gaza,
yes.
East Jerusalem,
exactly,
including the Jewish state.
Exactly. So that was to be the borders of the Jewish state, and that was the borders of the mandate of Palestine until 1948. Now, the international community became worried that the creation of a Jewish state would lead to Arab violence, which already started in the 1930s. So they did the typical thing. They said, hey guys, why don't you take half of half now? Why don't we split the proposal...
The remaining half.
The proposal of the General Assembly in 1947, which was a proposal because the General Assembly does not have the power to divide political entities. The General Assembly is not an international legislature. So we spoke about where does international law come from. The UN is created by a treaty. So it has the powers given to it
120-something states that are members.
Well, almost 190 now.
190.
But it has the powers given to it by the UN Charter. So the General Assembly has the powers given to it by the UN Charter. Those powers include approving its own budget.
And not creating a state.
Not doing anything. It's not a legislature. It's more like the European Parliament. Or, if anything, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council
So,
of Europe.
1948, Israeli declaration of a state, Jewish declaration of Israel was given by the fact that it had borders that were recognized by the international community.
So the question is, Israel. So the mandate ends in 1948. The British, which were the mandatory powers, the mandate is over. Israel becomes independent in 1948. What are the borders of Israel at the moment of its independence? And so for that, there is a rule of international law, a customary rule actually. And how do we know this rule exists? Because it's applied to determine the borders of new countries time after time. And that is that when you have a new country, it gets the previous administrative borders of the entity in that territory. This is basically something that happens in decolonization situations or in the collapse of a federal system like Yugoslavia,
Former Soviet
Union. So, for example, Vladimir Putin says that Crimea belongs to Russia. Now, if you look at the criteria of self-determination, he's absolutely right. Most people in Crimea are Russians and want to be. If you look at the point of history, he's right. For most of history, it's been part of the Russian Empire. If you look at the point of geography...
But since in the 1970s, Khrushchev...
50s, yes.
50s, dumped it onto the Ukrainian...
Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet Union was composed of 16 Soviet Socialist republics. In the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev removed Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic and just gave it as a present to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. What gave him the authority to do that? Is it fair? Is it just? Whatever. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party, so he could do whatever he wanted. And that's what he did. But as a result of that act, Crimea is now part of Ukraine because at the moment of Ukraine's independence, its borders included Crimea. Why have such a rule? It seems arbitrary and unjust. Because all political borders are
based on that.
To some extent, a consequence of some unjust, arbitrary, unfair, historic decision. Nothing's perfectly fair. And if you have to draw, how do you draw?
Hungary knows a lot about that. Right. When 2/3 of its territory was taken away by the Versailles Treaty. Yeah.
So how do you know? But also, what is fair? Right? What is fair? If you include all of the ethnic group of the neighboring country, then you're going to have a minority. If you do it the opposite way, it flips. Very hard to figure out. What are perfect. Political boundaries never purely match demographic ones. They should, should they match demographic, topographic? That's a consideration. That's why the Jordan River is a natural boundary. So what you favor stability. So otherwise, every time a new country is created,
every 10 years you would have a new census, and then everything would change.
You would have a war over borders. Okay, so what does this mean? This means the moment. So let's take Jordan for example. The moment Jordan becomes a country, what are its borders? The border of the Transjordan part of the Mandate for Palestine. The moment Lebanon is created, what are its borders? The borders of the Lebanon part of the Syria Mandate. So the moment Israel is
why couldn't the Jews say, since the Arabs did not agree on accepting those borders, right? And they didn't proclaim, they didn't declare a state. I'm talking in 1948, 47, 48, the Arabs did not declare their own state.
Yes, so that is key. So the Jews are the only group that declared a state in these borders. But that means the borders of the new state are clearly the borders of the Mandate for Palestine, which means they include Judea and Samaria and Gaza. Now, the only question is, what if the Arabs had declared a state? Okay, so that would be a different question. But in fact, and it's important that they didn't. Because, since 1968, Palestinians have declared independence like 4 or 5 times. They do it to issue new press releases. But in 1948, they did it 0 times. And that has consequences. Now, what would have happened had they declared independence? Nothing fundamentally different from what actually did happen. Because when you have 2 groups who contend to be the government of the same territory, it doesn't change the boundaries of the territory. This happens, for example, like in Libya. After Gaddafi, 3 different groups said they're the government of Libya. But the borders of Libya don't change. Now they're probably going to have a fight and decide and see who wins. So what would have happened? Israel would have had a war with the Arabs, which is exactly what they did anyway.
So had Israel in 1948, in its War of Independence, had it tried to expand to Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, to which Jordan actually expanded itself.
It was not a matter of trying to expand. It was a matter of Jordan seized it very quickly.
Jordan seized it because they had the upper hand. Yes. But had Israel had the upper hand, let's say, then then today the borders of Israel would look totally different.
And I think they do look totally different because in 1967,
That's exactly what happened.
And it's exactly like what would happen if today Ukraine would retake Crimea. Would anyone say, you're occupying Russian territory? It's been Russian for 10 years. Everyone's there is Russian. They don't want you. No, they'd say you've restored Ukrainian territory.
Hang on. So Judeans... okay, you're right.
And so it's exactly the same situation.
All right. Let's look at the ICC or ICJ issue about Israel now committing war crimes and accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant of committing war crimes and basically an arrest warrant has been issued for them.
Is about to be issued.
Is about to be issued for them. Also on the same side of the page, two fine gentlemen were mentioned. Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Daif.
Ismail Khania also, I think.
Ismail Khania also, perhaps.
You see, they're being fair. 3-2.
That's right. So, could you explain a little bit about this? About why this causes outrage? Apart from the fact that how could you put on the same scale leaders of a democratically elected government in an existing legitimate state and leaders of a terrorist organization that is not a state, B, it's a terrorist organization.
So as I mentioned before, there is no such thing as a world court. The ICC is not a world court. The ICC is an organization created by a treaty. That treaty is called the Rome Statute. So the ICC only has jurisdiction over countries that join. Most countries that are likely to participate in military conflict are not part. The United States, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, etc.
So it's pretty much a safe game to join for those countries where wars don't exactly. Like Switzerland joining the ICC.
For European countries, it's purely a theatrical, performative exercise. A bunch of African countries joined, and most ICC cases, almost all of ICC cases, were actually about African countries for the past 20 years.
Because that's where wars are at.
Because that's where the wars are at. And then this led to a big backlash because they said it was racist and colonialist. So there was great pressure on the ICC to go after not an African country. But who are you going to go after? They don't have wars in Europe. But the point is, Israel never joined the ICC treaty. A, because they didn't think it would be a fair court. America didn't join. Israel can't join if America doesn't join. So this is a court. Israel has no jurisdiction over Israel.
Yeah.
So what they did is they invented a Palestinian state. Only countries can join. So the Palestinians said, "Hey, we have a state," which is interesting because I thought they don't. That's what we need a two-state solution for. We have a state, so take us as members. And already and the ICC agreed to that. So already from the beginning, the entire exercise was based on the recognition of a fictitious Palestinian state and the complete acceptance of the Palestinian narrative. What are the borders of this state? What are the borders? How does it get to the borders? Is Gaza part of the borders? Why is Gaza, which was occupied by Egypt until 1967, part of the same political entity as the West Bank that was occupied by Jordan until 1967? What do they have in common? So they created so Israel is the only non-member state being prosecuted on behalf of a member that's not a state. There's nothing like it. It's
absurd.
The very language of the ICC statute was written specifically by Arab countries to target Israel. They changed several definitions of war crimes to try to make settlements illegal. So the bias was baked in. And so they have no jurisdiction. The whole thing was an exercise of lawfare by the Palestinian government. And they know that they win no matter what happens. Because yes, Hamas leaders have been indicted, but everyone knows Hamas is a terror group. It doesn't stop them from treating them seriously and giving them some respect and conducting negotiations with them. But Hamas doesn't have a reputation to lose. Also, everyone knows the ICC has no police. They have no enforcement mechanisms. So how do they get anyone? Basically, the answer is they don't. So they've never successfully prosecuted incumbent leaders
when a country like Germany says, that it would, in fact, carry out the rulings of the ICC. And I've had Prime Minister Netanyahu set foot right now, today, in Berlin,
so that
he
means,
would be
so
arrested.
so that means he won't set foot. Right, so, for example,
for sure.
There's no question the Hamas people are not going to be prosecuted by the ICC. Why? Is the ICC going to go catch them? How are they going to prosecute them? The only way that Hamas people could be prosecuted is if they lose power. And what's the only way they're going to lose power?
Israel winning.
Israel winning. Exactly. In which case, Israel's certainly not going to be giving them to be tried by The Hague. They're going to want to try them themselves. On the other hand, Israeli leaders, right, for them, it
does matter.
Because it's a democracy, right?
For sure.
So Ismail Haniyeh is getting billions out of being running Hamas. An Israeli prime minister is going to retire and be a normal private citizen. So for them, the indictment might carry a greater deterrent. So what it does is it disproportionately deters democracies fighting illiberal regimes. And in this case, of course, the charges are completely unfounded. Starvation. Israel has always allowed supplies in, and we know that the Hamas prevents food from getting to people. They steal the supplies. Hamas is not starving, so they are taking the food for the Palestinian people, and Israel is being accused of Hamas's crimes.
One last question, and I'm going to let you go. The toughest one I left for the end. A two-state solution, quote-unquote two-state solution, Palestinian state. So let's see the scenarios that could happen. The reality on the ground is that there is today the state of Israel with about 7 million Jewish citizens and about 2 million Arab citizens. I'm just simplifying the facts, but that's pretty much what it is. 7 million Jews, 2 million Arabs. Israeli citizens. You got the West Bank, about 2 million Arabs, let's say, in the West Bank. And I'm not talking about the Jewish settlements, I'm just talking about the Arabs. About 2.5 million over there, and about 2 million in Gaza, Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, as they call themselves. So the situation is, regarding the two-state solution is, there's really a few options on the table. One option is, let's say, the Trump plan. Which would create a Palestinian state that would have been surrounded or would be surrounded in Israel. It would be like an island within Israel, no borders to any other Arab states, which would give sufficient protection for the state of Israel for any war starting, let's say, in Jordan or Syria or any of the neighboring countries. Second option is Israel extending its jurisdiction over the entire West Bank, let's say. Then it would have to absorb 2 million Arab citizens. Had Israel extend its borders on Gaza also, that would mean another 2 million Arab citizens, which would leave us with 7 million Jews versus 6 million Arabs. The Jewish state would not be Jewish in less than a decade, probably. Third option is all those Arabs being absorbed by neighboring countries, West Bank Arabs to Jordan, Gazan Arabs to Egypt, which probably is not happening because, as you rightly said, Jordan is a Palestinian state, meaning that about 70% of the population is Palestinian Arab, ruled by a minority Hashemite family that would be toppled by even more if they had more Palestinian citizens. So and Egypt also don't want 2 million Gazans because of terrorism and other reasons. And so how do you see? And then one state is again not a real solution. One state for both nations or both peoples. I think the $1 million question is, if there would be an Arab state, a Palestinian Arab state, next to the state of Israel, that Palestinian Arab state would be Judenrein. There would be not one Jew living in there, whereas Israel would, as a Jewish state, would have 2 million Arabs. How is that fair? That today you have 56 Muslim countries with zero Jewish population, or close to zero Jewish population, and you got one Jewish country with 20% Arab population. But leaving that aside, how do you see the end of this whole conflict? Is there an end to those conflicts? I have my own personal take on it, which I'm not going to bore you with, because I have a religious way of looking at it.
Mashiach. So people often say, expect solution. The fact that a conflict has gone on for so long does not mean that there's some easy, if only we just saw it.
No, for sure.
If only it was just right on the table, we're looking at it. This is the typical Middle East, Washington Arabist Middle East think tank approach. That there's like a great solution just right on the table. It's
Nobody
just
wants
both
it.
the Palestinians and the Israelis don't want it. So only the smart people in the think tanks and state departments want it. In fact, there's no good solution, and I think the two-state solution did a brilliant marketing job by using the word solution in its name. So you think, oh, that's a solution. Well, just because it has the word solution in its name doesn't make it a solution. And I think a European audience will understand this. One thing we've really seen in the past decade in Europe is that political boundaries do not determine demographics. That is to say, populations can move across demographic boundaries, political boundaries. So all the numbers you mentioned, and we can dispute them a little bit, but there would not be more Jews or fewer Arabs, regardless of where you draw the boundaries.
True.
And what happens if the Arabs choose to migrate? What if they just walk over? We're talking about the smallest distances in the world.
Sure.
What if they just
Across
walk?
the street.
What if they just walk? What if they have, like the Gazans tried, a great march of return? Or what if they shoot rockets at Ben Gurion Airport, which would be like a kilometer away from the Palestinian state? They could shoot BB guns. That would basically take out a plane on the runway. So then all the Jews get on the next plane, and that's also the end of the Jewish state. So the two-state solution is not a solution. Some version of the Trump plan is not a bad idea. And also the question is, why does it have to be a Palestinian state? So Israel can exercise jurisdiction over those areas of Judea and Samaria where Jews live, and maintain a Palestinian authority to provide for meaningful autonomy and self-governance.
Autonomy, basically, it will be.
Yeah, exactly. Much like the current situation, which is, by the way, more autonomy than pretty much every national group gets.
Enjoys anywhere
in the world. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's important. Israel doesn't tax them. Israel does not make their school curriculums. Israel does not govern their lives in any way except those which make it harder to kill Israelis.
Mm. Professor Kontorovich, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and an honor to meet you, and I hope to see you in Budapest again, or maybe in Israel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.